Hello, 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 hello. You already know what it is. Today we have another Camus reading video. I have been listening back to my old philosophy videos, and in particular, I have been listening to my Camus video. So I know it's pretty soon after I released my last one, but I did want to film another one just because I'm interested in continuing on with the essay. So I'm going to just pick up right where we left off here. I don't know if you remember. It is right after... I'll go over the last few lines of the last paragraph so you guys can remember where we're at. Of course, Camus was discussing absurdity, but that's kind of what the whole essay discusses. So the last part of the paragraph said, "Above all, I must adapt my behavior to them and pursue them in all their consequences. I'm speaking here of decency, but I want to know beforehand if thought can live in those deserts." So the next part goes right on to talk about these deserts. "I already know that thought has at least entered those deserts. There it found its bread. There it realized that it had previously been feeding on phantoms. It justified some of the most urgent themes of human reflection. From the moment absurdity is recognized, it becomes a passion, the most harrowing of them all. But whether or not one can live with one's passions, whether or not one can accept their law, which is to burn the heart they simultaneously exalt, that is the whole question. It is not, however, the one we shall ask just yet. It stands at the center of this experience. There will be time to come back to it. Let us recognize rather those themes and those impulses born in the desert. It will suffice to enumerate them. They, too, are known to all today. There have always been men to defend the rights of the irrational. The tradition of what may be called humiliated thought has never ceased to exist. The criticism of rationalism has been made so often that it seems unnecessary to begin again. Yet our epoch is marked by rebirth of those paradoxical systems that strive to trip up the reason as if truly it had always forged ahead. But that is not so much of a proof of the efficacy of the reason as the intensity of its hopes. On the plane of history, such a constancy of two attitudes illustrates the essential passion of man torn between his urge toward unity and the clear vision he may have of the walls enclosing him. But never perhaps at any time has the attack on reason been more violent than in ours. Since Zarathustra's great outburst, by chance it is the oldest nobility in the world. I conferred it upon all things when I proclaimed that above them to no eternal will was exercised. Since Kierkegaard's fatal illness, that malady that leads to death with nothing else following, the significant and tormenting themes of the absurd thought have followed one another. Or, at least, his proviso is of capital importance, the themes of a rational and religious thought. From Jaspers to Heidegger, from Kierkegaard to Chestov, from the phenomenologist to Scheller, on the logical plane and on the moral plane, a whole family of minds related by their nostalgia, but opposed by their methods and their aims, have persisted in blocking the royal road of reason and in recovering the direct paths of truth. Here I assume these thoughts to be known and lived. Whatever may be or have been their ambitions, all started out from that indescribable universe where contradiction, antimony, anguish, and impotence reigns. And what they have in common is precisely the themes so far disclosed. For them, too, it must be said that what matters above all is the conclusions they have managed to draw from those discoveries. That matters so much that they must be examined separately. But for the moment, we are concerned solely with their discoveries and their initial experiments. We are concerned solely with noting their agreement. If it would be presumptuous to try to deal with their philosophies, it is possible and sufficient in any case to bring out the climate that is common to them. Heidegger considers the human condition coldly and announces that existence is humiliated. The only reality is anxiety in the whole chain of beings. To the man lost in the world and its diversions, this anxiety is a brief, fleeting fear. But if that fear becomes conscious of itself, it becomes anguish, the perpetual climate of the lucid man in whom existence is concentrated. This professor of philosophy writes without trembling and in the most abstract language in the world that the finite and limited character of human existence is more primordial than man himself. His interest in Kant extends only to recognizing the restricted character of his pure reason. This is to conclude at the end of his analyses that the world can no longer offer anything to the man filled with anguish. This anxiety seems to him so much more important than all the categories in the world that he thinks and talks only of it. He enumerates its aspects. Boredom, when the ordinary man strives to quash it in him and benumb it. Terror, when the mind contemplates death. He too does not separate the consciousness from the absurd. The consciousness of death is the call of anxiety, and the existence then delivers itself its own summons through the intermediary of consciousness. It is the very voice of anguish, and it adjures existence to return from its loss in the anonymous they. For him, too, one must not sleep, but must keep alert until the consummation. He stands in this absurd world and points out its ephemeral character. He seeks his way amid these ruins. Jaspers despairs of any ontology because he claims that we have lost naivety. He knows that we can achieve nothing that will transcend the fatal game of appearances. He knows that the end of the mind is failure. He tarries over the spiritual adventures revealed by history and pitilessly discloses the flaw in each system, the illusion that saved everything, the preaching that hid nothing. In this ravaged world in which the impossibility of knowledge is established, in which everlasting nothingness seems the only reality, and irremediable despair seems the only attitude, he tries to recover the Ariadne's thread that leads to the divine secrets. Chestov, for his part, throughout a wonderfully monotonous work, constantly straining toward the same truths, tirelessly demonstrates that the tightest system, the most universal rationalism, always stumbles eventually on the irrational human thought. None of the ironic facts or ridiculous contradictions that depreciate the reason escapes him. One thing only interests him, and that is the exception, whether in the domain of the heart or the mind. Through Dostoevskian experiences of the condemned man, the exacerbated adventures of the Nietzschean mind, Hamlet's imprecations, and the bitter aristocracy of Ibsen, he tracks down, illuminates, and magnifies the human revolt against the irremediable. He refuses the reason its reasons and begins to advance with some decision only in the middle of that colorless desert where all certainties have become stones. Of all perhaps the most engaging, Kierkegaard, for a part of his existence at least, does more than discover the absurd. He lives it. The man who writes, "The surest of stubborn silence is not to hold one's tongue but to talk. Make sure in the beginning that no truth is absolute or can render satisfactory an existence that is impossible in itself." Don Juan of the understanding, he multiplies pseudonyms and contradictions, writes his Disclosures of Edification at the same time as that manual of cynical spiritualism, the Diary of the Seducer. He refuses consolations, ethics, reliable principles. As for that thorn he feels in his heart, he's careful not to quiet its pain. On the contrary, he awakens it, and, in the desperate joy of a man crucified and happy to be so, he builds up piece by piece, lucidity, refusal, make-believe, a category of a man possessed. That face both tender and sneering, those pirouettes followed by a cry from the heart, are the absurd spirit itself grappling with a reality beyond its comprehension. And the spiritual adventure that leads Kierkegaard to his beloved scandals begins likewise in the chaos of an experience divested of its setting and relegated to its original incoherence. On quite a different plane, that of method, Husserl and the phenomenologist, by their extravagances, reinstate the world in its diversity and deny the transcendent power of the reason. The spiritual universe becomes incalculably enriched through them. The rose petal, the milestone, or the human hand are as important as love, desire, or the laws of gravity. Thinking ceases to be unifying or making a semblance familiar in the guise of a major principle. Thinking is learning all over again to see, to be attentive, to focus consciousness. It is turning every idea and every image, in the manner of Proust, into a privileged moment. What justifies thought is its extreme consciousness. Though more positive than Kierkegaard's or Chestov's, Husserl's manner of proceeding, in the beginning, nevertheless negates the classic method of the reason, disappoints hope, opens intuition, and to the heart a whole proliferation of phenomena, the wealth of which has about it something inhuman. These paths lead to all sciences or to none. This amounts to saying that in this case, the means are more important than the end. All that is involved is an attitude for understanding, and not a consolation. Let me repeat it, in the beginning, at the very least. How can one fail to feel the basic relationship of these minds? How can one fail to see that they take their stand around a privileged and bitter moment in which hope has no further place? I want everything to be explained to me or nothing. And the reason is impotent when it hears this cry from the heart. The mind, aroused by this insistence, seeks and finds nothing but contradictions and nonsense. What I fail to understand is nonsense. The world is peopled with such irrationals. The world itself, whose single meaning I do not understand, is but a vast irrational. If one could only say just once, "This is clear," all would be saved. But these men vie with one another in proclaiming that nothing is clear. All is chaos. That all man has is his lucidity and his definite knowledge of the walls surrounding him. All these experiences agree and confirm one another. The mind, when it reaches its limits, must make a judgment and choose its conclusions. This is where suicide and the reply stand. But I wish to reverse the order of the inquiry and start out from the intelligent adventure and come back to daily acts. The experiences called to mind here were born in the desert that we must not leave behind. At least it is essential to know how far they went. At this point of his effort, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. This must not be forgotten. This must be clung to because the whole consequence of a life can depend on it. The irrational, the human nostalgia, and the absurd that is born of their encounter, these are the three characters in the drama that must necessarily end with all logic of which an existence is capable. And this was a shorter section, but this is where we'll stop for today because the next section is philosophical suicide, which is a big next topic. So I think that'd be a great place to pick up on and maybe do an extra long video next time to go from philosophical suicide all the way down to the absurd freedom section. But let me know if you like this, if you had any thoughts about this, if you have other philosophy readings that you would like me to do, or if you're excited to hear more Camus in the future. So have an amazing night, and good night, good day, good studying, whatever you got going on. Bye.